Turn to the book of Genesis chapter 35, and as you're turning there in your Bible, let me set the stage for what we're going to be studying tonight. After Jacob had returned to Haran, now let me tell you the correct pronunciation. I'm not going to pronounce it like this, but the correct pronunciation is Haran. But that actually sounds more redneck to me, and that's not how Cherokee County does it. Believe it or not, we don't pronounce it right when we could. But after Jacob had returned from Haran with his family, he eventually settled in the vicinity of Shechem. He settled there because there was plenty of water, and his flocks could graze on the surrounding hills. Let me show you a couple of maps that will explain why it's such a good place to, in a sense, settle down. Now, this just kind of gives you an overall view of this. Here's the Dead Sea down here. Here's the Sea of Galilee. This is Bethel. Here is Shechem. Now, I'm going to show you a different map in just a second, but I'm going to show you right in here. This up here is the valley of what we call Armageddon. It's technically the Jezreel Valley. Notice it says Megiddo there. Well, Megiddo actually is the name of a city, and it's called the Mountain of Megiddo. When you get there, it's not really a mountain at all. It's just a tell. There's been 25 different cities that's been built upon this. So basically, it's like a little hill, but we are very familiar with it because we've been taught about the Battle of Armageddon. Now let me show you the second map. This gives you a little bit better picture of this. Here's the Sea of Galilee, here's the Dead Sea, and this is the Jordan Valley. This is the Jezreel Valley, and Megiddo is about right there. Now the valley technically begins here, but to the Jews, it's basically referring all the way up to the Mediterranean Sea. It comes down here. It actually goes towards the Sea of Galilee, and Nazareth is right up here. And it continues on and goes into the Jordan Valley. So when all of the nations come to fight against Jesus, remember when Jesus returns, there's going to be this battle in the Valley of Armageddon. Actually, they're all going to be in here and all the way down to the Jordan Valley. Jerusalem is right over here. What they're going to do is they're going to cut them off, and the only thing that they'll be able to do is actually run to the Mediterranean Sea or to the desert. That's why they're doing it when it comes to the end time. But of course, Jesus doesn't need to retreat, does he? No. He's just going to be able to slay them by the word of his mouth, the sword that proceeds from his mouth. But that gives you a good idea of Shechem and where it's located. Now let me tell you why it was a good place to locate there. First of all, you didn't want to be too close to the Jezreel Valley, because any time that raiders would come in, they would go through the valley because that was the most lucrative spot. Everyone wanted to be by the valley because you could grow so many crops there. It's a very fertile place, lots of water there. But if you were by yourself, you would be easy pickings. You didn't want to be by the Jordan Valley for the very same reasons. But where Shechem was located, you had a little bitty valley that was there. And all of those hills, he could take all the flocks that he had, he could graze there, and there is lots of water in that area. Now, the only problem with this area was the sexual depravity of the inhabitants. You see, the citizens of Shechem were very promiscuous. They did not understand the concept of sexual purity. That was just a foreign thought to them. And the reason they didn't understand the concept of sexual purity was because sex was a part of their worship. They practiced what scholars refer to as imitation magic. And every once in a while, you'll see it referred to as sympathetic magic, but imitation magic is actually a more accurate term. They actually believed that when the gods or the fertility gods had sex, the earth became fertile. In other words, the earth received the proper amount of rain at the proper time, their crops flourished, and their flocks produced more and healthier offspring. So to stimulate the fertility gods to have sex, they performed sex acts as part of their worship because they believed that they could excite the gods, kind of like pornography, by performing these sex acts, and the gods would then imitate what they were doing, making the earth fertile. That's why it's called imitation magic. Now, as you can imagine, this type of worship created a very promiscuous society. And Dinah, being very young and naive, thought that her parents, Jacob and Leah, were being overprotective. So while her brothers were in the field and the older women were busy around the camp, she snuck off to visit some of her friends. And she ended up being raped by the prince of Shechem, whose name was also Shechem. But even worse, she was being held captive in his home. And of course, his home, being the prince of Shechem, was inside the city. So Jacob and her brothers had to figure out a way to free her without getting themselves killed or hurting anyone. So they came up with this ingenious plan. Shechem wanted to marry Dinah because he was infatuated with her. So they told him and his father that the only way they would agree to this marriage is if every man in the city was circumcised. And because Shechem was in love with Dinah, he agreed to it. And he was able to talk all of the inhabitants or all of the men of the city into being circumcised because after all, he was a prince. So the plan was, on the third day, when all the men were incapacitated from the pain of being circumcised, the brothers were going to go into Shechem and free their sister. But Simeon and Levi didn't just want to free their sister. She wasn't a half-sister to them, she was a full sister. So they wanted revenge. So they went ahead of their brothers and they killed all the men of the city. So when the brothers came, according to plan, they found all of the men dead. So what else could they do? They plundered the city and they carried away all of the women and small children. Believe it or not, that was really the most compassionate thing to do in those circumstances. Now, once Jacob found out what Simeon and Levi had done, he was afraid that the surrounding cities who had an alliance with Shechem would retaliate and attack them, wiping them out. And that brings us to chapter 35. So let's look at verse number 1. Then God said to Jacob, "Go up to Bethel and settle there, and build an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau." Now remember, the word Bethel means house of God. And it was Jacob who actually named this place. Because before it was named Luz, and in fact at that time it was still named Luz, but he named it Bethel. Look with me if you would in the book of Genesis chapter 28 verses 18 and 19. The next morning Jacob got up very early. He took the stone he had rested his head against and he set it upright as a memorial pillar. Then he poured olive oil over it. He named the place Bethel, which means house of God, although it was previously called Luz. So Jacob was going back to where God had spoken to him in this supernatural dream. If you remember, God showed him in this dream this ladder. And when we think of a ladder, we think of maybe a ladder where one person can go. But no, this is more like a staircase. And it was so wide, and all of these angels were going up to God to get orders and coming down to carry out his will. And what God was telling Jacob was, I will be with you no matter where you go. These are the host of my army. They do my bidding, and they will protect over you, and they will bless you. Now, the reason God said to go up to Bethel is because Bethel is about 2,900 feet above sea level. So you literally go up to Bethel. You climb up Bethel. In fact, Bethel is about 1,000 feet higher in elevation than Shechem. Bethel is also about 19 miles south of Shechem. Let's look at that first map again, if you don't mind. Let me show you how it lays out. This here is Shechem. There is an ancient road that goes from Shechem to Bethel on to Jerusalem. It says here Salem, but that becomes Jerusalem. 7 miles south is Bethlehem, and then on down to Hebron, also called Memories in Abraham's day. But there's an ancient road that tied all of that together. And so when he leaves Shechem, he's going to Bethel. He's traveling on this ancient road that climbs up to one of the highest places, besides Mount Hermon, one of the highest places in Jerusalem. Now, let's read verses 2 through 4. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, "Get rid of the foreign gods you have with you and purify yourselves and change your clothes. Then come, let us go to Bethel, where I will build an altar to God, who answered me in the day of my distress and who has been with me wherever I have gone." So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods they had and the rings in their ears, and Jacob buried them under the oak at Shechem. Now, if you remember, when Jacob was fleeing from Esau to Haran, he made a vow to God. He told God that if he watched over him and took care of him while he was away from his family, if he blessed him and prospered him, and he brought him home safely one day, then he would be his God. And he would serve him and only him. Look at Genesis chapter 28, verses 20 through 22. This is right after he has this dream about this staircase. Then Jacob made this vow. if God will indeed be with me and protect me on this journey, and if he will provide me with food and clothing, and if I return safely to my father's home, then the Lord will certainly be my God. In other words, I will serve him and him only, because he won't be bound to just one specific piece of land, one particular territory. No, if he can protect me wherever I go, he alone is God, and I will serve him. Now, notice what else he says. And this memorial pillar I have set up will become a place for worshiping God. That's why he named it Bethel, house of God. God is here. It's where he's talked to me. And I will present to God, notice this, a tenth of everything he gives me. A tithe from everything he gives me. Well, Jacob had been home for a while, but he hadn't fulfilled his vow. Not completely. So like most people, now that he's in trouble, now that Simeon and Levi have killed all of these men in the city of Shechem, and you've got all of the other cities who are in an alliance with them, and he feels like he's in trouble and he's scared to death, and he needs God's help, now he's finally ready to do what? To make good on his vow. It's time to get serious with God. You know what I'm talking about? You told God you would serve him probably 4 or 5 years ago, and you know, things were prosperous, so before you know it, you weren't serving him, and then one day trouble strikes, and what do? You get serious with God. I'm going to rededicate my life. And this is Jacob. It's time to get serious with God. And now God appears to him and says, you need to go back to Bethel. You need a mountaintop experience with me. So before Jacob makes this pilgrimage to Bethel, he knows he needs to make a formal renunciation of all pagan gods. Now let's be honest, Jacob did not have any pagan gods, but his family did. If you remember, Rachel had stolen her father's gods, and she had brought them with her. And when Jacob's sons had looted Shechem, you know they took some of their idols. Now why do I say that? Because at that time, the idols that were placed in temples were made out of silver and gold. That's why it was referred to as sacrilege, and that's kind of what Paul is talking about in the book of Romans when he says, do you commit sacrilege? But anyways, you're taking what belongs to God. But what's interesting is the idols of that time, if they were placed in a temple, they were usually made out of precious metal, gold or silver. So when they looted the city, they weren't going to leave any gold or silver behind. So they were going to take those. Now, the family gods, the gods that were in the homes, were usually made out of terracotta. So they weren't really very valuable. But remember, they carried away the women. What's the first thing the women are going to do when they are carried away? They're going to grab not only their children, but their family gods. So the women from Shechem would have brought with them their household gods. So for Jacob to make good on his vow to God, he had to get rid of all of the pagan gods that were in his camp. So he told everyone in the camp to get rid of their pagan gods and purify themselves. But there's a specific way he's going to get rid of them. We're going to see that. Look at verse number 2 again, and then we'll jump down a little bit further. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, get rid of the foreign gods you have with you, and purify yourselves and change your clothes. But then Jacob took it a step further. He took all of the pagan gods and their earrings, and he buried them. Look at verse 4 again. So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods they had and the rings in their ears, and Jacob buried them under the oak at Shechem. Now, let me explain why he buried them. Because the ones that were made out of gold or silver could have been melted down. They would have been very valuable. Hey, if you don't believe in them, why don't you just melt it down? And now you've got gold and you've got silver. But he didn't do that. He buried them. And let me explain why. By burying them, it symbolized that they were dead to him. But more importantly, it symbolized that Jacob did not believe in these gods. They didn't need to be destroyed by fire. They didn't need to be pounded and smashed to destroy their power. He wanted to show everyone in the camp that these are dead, useless, inanimate objects. And the best thing to do is to bury it. These are dead gods. And that's what burying symbolized. Now, did anyone notice, because I called attention to it, that they also buried their earrings? Why did they do that? Well, that's because in their culture at that time, the women would wear their family gods as earrings, little miniature gods, and they would put them in their ears. So they buried those earrings right along with the other images. Now, let me see if I can explain why they did that with earrings. How many of you have ever had a St. Christopher? Okay, you're all young. In the 70s, if you had a boyfriend, if you girls or guys, if you had a girlfriend, when it came time for Christmas or Valentine's Day or whatever, many times I'd either buy an ID bracelet or a St. Christopher because that was cool to wear. Didn't matter whether you were Catholic or not, you wore St. Christopher. Be honest, how many men wore a St. Christopher because your girlfriend got you one? One hand back there. You're old. My wife was too godly to do that, right, honey? Anyways, let me explain what a St. Christopher is. St. Christopher is actually the saint of travel. And according to tradition, Catholic tradition, if you look at a picture of St. Christopher, that day you won't die that day in your travels. As you're traveling for that day, you won't die. So a lot of sailors, they actually carried on the ship a picture of St. Christopher. But what you would do if you were traveling somewhere is you would look at it. Then sailors started wearing St. Christophers, and people who would go on travel would do that. And so what they would do every morning is they would take it off their neck, they would take a look at the picture of it and kiss it. Now, that's the very same thing that their culture did with their little family gods. If they took them with them, they never had to leave them at home. So if you're out in the field, then your family gods are with you and they can protect you. So here Jacob is, and he doesn't just say, bring the idols, don't just bring your family. Give me your earrings too. We're bearing them all. Now, look at verse number 5. Then they set out, and the terror of God fell on the towns all around them, so that no one pursued them. Now, wait a minute. These towns had an alliance with Shechem. And Jacob was so afraid that the other cities were going to be angry and they were going to retaliate against them for what Simeon and Levi had done. But here's what's interesting. Just the opposite happened. They stayed in their cities and they shivered. God sent a terror there. And I'll be honest with you now, I'm not just trying to look for a natural explanation because I believe in the supernatural. And the majority of the time, when I'm reading through the Bible and something happens, I go, wow, that was supernatural. But every once in a while, as you're reading through, you see that God uses the natural too. So let me explain why everyone was so afraid. At that time, in the land of Canaan, Canaanites were not familiar with circumcision. Now later on it's going to happen and they're going to be familiar, but at that time in Canaan, the Canaanites were not familiar with circumcision. So they had no idea the pain and the soreness it caused during the healing process. So from their perspective, and even from the wife's perspective, 2 men just walked into the city of Shechem and they killed all of the men. And they were incapacitated. This must be something supernatural because these 2 guys, they came in and this man couldn't even rise up to fight and they just pierced him. And then they went over here to the next man and he said, honey, give me my sword. But he didn't even get up and they pierced him. Some supernatural power must have kept them down. So whoever had escaped to tell them said it was unbelievable. They wiped out all of the men with just 2 men. So here Jacob is that he's scared to death that they're going to pursue him, but instead this terror seizes them. Oh my gosh. Who are these people? The 2 men from their camp can walk into a city and kill all of the men in the city. We need to leave them alone. Now look at verses 6 and 7. Jacob and all the people with him came to Luz. That is Bethel. That's the name that Jacob had given it in the land of Canaan. There he built an altar, and he called the place El Bethel. Now what does Bethel mean? House of God. What does El mean in Hebrew? God. So what did he call the place? God of the house of God. Because it was there that God revealed himself to him when he was fleeing from his brother. Now, why did Jacob build an altar? Because the first time, all he did was he took the stone and he made this memorial pillar out of it. And he poured the oil on it. So you would think he would come back and he would do the very same thing. But he didn't do that. Instead, Jacob builds an altar there. Does anyone know why? There's no Mosaic sacrifice at this time, right? There's no sacrificial system that's in place. Why in the world would he build an altar? Well, he built the altar to fulfill his vow. Remember, Jacob had vowed to give God 10% of all that he had when he returned home safely. Look back at Genesis chapter 28, verses 20 through 22. Most of us missed that when we were going through there. Then Jacob made his vow, if God will indeed be with me and protect me on this journey, and if he will provide me with food and clothing, and if I return safely to my father's home, then the Lord will certainly be my God. I will serve him and only him, is what that means. And this memorial pillar I've set up will become a place for worshiping God. How do you worship God? Sacrifices and offering. But more importantly, and I will present to God 1/10 of everything he gives me. So Jacob intends to fulfill his vow. From this time on, he won't allow any pagan idols in his camp, and he will serve the one and only true God, the God of his father and grandfather. At this point, he's known as El Shaddai. There's a few times he was referred to as Yahweh. Later on, it's almost always Yahweh. But at this time, El Shaddai, the God of the breast that's going to protect you and is going to provide for you. And then he presented to God on this altar 1/10 of everything he owned in recognition that it was God who had given it to him. Now, how did he present his tithe to God? Well, that's why he built the altar. And after he calculated what his total worth was, the wealth that he had gained, he sacrificed livestock on the altar to God until the total sacrifice equaled 1/10 of his wealth. Isn't that something? Wow. That was the whole purpose of the altar, to present to God 1/10 of what God had given him. So once again, we see an example of tithing before the law was ever given. Abraham did it. Remember, he gave 1/10 of everything that he owned to who? Melchizedek. And the implication is he did that frequently. Isaac did it. The implication is there. And Jacob now has also done it. Now, what's kind of interesting to me, and I want you to think about this. Now we use the tithe to do great things for God. We pay for the building. We send money to missionaries. We do ministry with it. We pay salaries for those on staff. We pay for all the utilities, so we have air conditioning tonight. That's what we use the tithe for. But I want you to understand, before the Mosaic system, here he is, and he's given this 1/10 to God on the altar. Think about this. All of a sudden, you bring this bull, and you slay it, and you burn it on the altar. What good is it? Now you're bringing these heifers in, and you're bringing these lambs in, you're bringing these goats in, and you're sacrificing all of this, and there's no purpose, it seems. But it didn't matter. It was God's. And Jacob said, you've given it to me. To everyone else, this might look like it's a waste. It might seem something that's foolish. It might seem like something that is stupid. But God, I made a decision. I made a vow. I would give you 1/10 of everything. And he did it. Now, look at verses 9 through 13. After Jacob returned from Padan Aram, God appeared to him again and he blessed him. God said to him, your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will be Israel. So he named him Israel. And God said to him, I am God Almighty, El Shaddai. Be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will be among your descendants. The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac I give also to you, and I will give this land to your descendants after you. Then God went up from him at the place where he had talked with him. Now, if you remember, when Jacob left for Haran, Isaac blessed him. And he prayed that God would give to Jacob the blessings of Abraham. Do you remember that? That's specifically what he blessed him with. That's what he prayed for. Look at Genesis 28, verses 3 through 4. Notice what Isaac's prayer is. May God Almighty bless you and give you many children, and may your descendants multiply and become many nations. May God pass on to you and your descendants the blessings he promised to Abraham. May you own this land where you are now living as a foreigner, for God gave this land to Abraham. Now, do you see that at the beginning of verse 4? May God pass on to you and your descendants the blessings he promised to Abraham. And that's exactly what God did at Bethel. He passed on to Jacob the blessings he promised to Abraham. In fact, sometime this week, if you have time, here's what I want you to do. I want you to compare what God promised to Jacob and what he promised to Abraham. You already know where he promised this to Jacob. Here it is in Genesis chapter 35 in these verses we just read. But go back to Genesis chapter 17, verses 1 through 8, and compare what he promises to Jacob to what he promised to Abraham. And what you're going to find is this. God passed on the promises of Abraham to Jacob. He fulfilled the blessing that Isaac gave. That also was further proof that Isaac knew he was wrong when he was going to give the birthright to Esau. He knew he was wrong. So when Jacob tricked him, not because he wanted to, but because Mama said so, Isaac could have pulled that back. But no, Isaac was a godly enough man to realize, you know what, Mama? What you did was wrong. The way you did it was wrong. But it's what God wants. So when he gets ready to go, Isaac blesses him, and he says, may God pass on to you the blessings of Abraham, the promises of Abraham, recognizing that it was through Jacob that the seed of the woman is going to come through. Wow. People, that's further confirmation that the seed of the Messiah, the seed of the woman, the Messiah, was going to come through Jacob, not Esau. Now, at Bethel, God changed Jacob's name to Israel. And this is actually the second time that he's done that. The first time, of course, was when Jacob was returning from Haran and about to meet Esau. And he was just about ready to cross the Jabbok River. Do you remember that? Everyone else had gone to the other side, and he was all alone by himself to make sure nothing was being left behind. It's what a man did. He wasn't going to leave anyone behind. And all of a sudden, this man came out of nowhere. And he begins to wrestle with Jacob. Now, later on, we're able to deduce that this is a Christophany. Remember, Christophany simply means a revelation of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. Jesus manifests himself. He appears physically in the Old Testament. We refer to that as a Christophany. Christ, of course, means Christ, and it comes from phaneo, which means to reveal. So it's a revealing of Jesus Christ. So, the person that he was wrestling with was who? Jesus. And Jesus says, let go. And he won't do it. He said, not until you bless me. Now, we know Jesus could have just whomped him good, but he wanted to bless him, and he wanted him to hang on, and he wanted him to be tenacious. So he changed his name to Israel. So this is the second time here at Bethel that Jacob is told that he'll no longer be called Jacob, he'll be called Israel. Now, what does Israel mean? Does anyone remember? Most people won't say this, but this is the truth. It means governed by God. And it became the name of the nation that God created from Jacob's descendants. So Jacob is the father of the Jewish nation that bears his new name, Israel. In fact, he is the eponymous ancestor of the Jewish nation. Now, does everyone know what the word eponym means? Because when you go over to Israel, it seems like there's all of these eponymous names here. An eponym is a person after whom something is named. So Jacob is the eponym for the nation of Israel. When his name was changed to Israel, he became the eponymous ancestor of the nation of Israel. It's named after him. Jacob's 12 sons are eponyms of the 12 tribes of Israel. So all of the 12 tribes are named after one of the sons of Jacob. So it's always Israel and the 12 tribes. Israel being the whole nation, but it's all summed up in this promise made to a man that used to be called Jacob, supplanter. But God's changed his name to govern by God. And Israel became a theocracy. They were to be governed by God. And when Jesus returns, he will set up his kingdom in Jerusalem. That's where his palace will be, and it will be a theocracy again. It will be a nation governed by God, referred to as Israel. Now, let's read verses 16 through 20 because we're getting to the good parts now. All of that is just information. Then they moved on from Bethel while they were still some distance from Ephrath, also known as Bethlehem. Rachel began to give birth, and she had great difficulty. And as she was having great difficulty in childbirth, the midwife said to her, "Don't despair, for you have another son." Which tells us what? How would she be able to tell she had another son? What type of birth is this? It's a breech birth. Not good. Don't despair, you have another son. As she breathed her last breath, for she was dying, she named her son Benoni, son of my suffering. But his father named him Benjamin. No, he won't be known as son of my suffering. He will be known as son of my right hand. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. Over her tomb, Jacob set up a pillar, and to this day that pillar marks Rachel's tomb. If you go to Israel with us and we go to Bethlehem, we don't get to stop at Rachel's tomb because that's under Palestinian control, and the Muslims don't like Christians or Jews coming to it, and I do not get that. Irritates me, but anyways. So, bottom line is, Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin, who was the last son Jacob ever had. Now, the reason Rachel's death is important is because it sets up what happens next. And this is something that most people have no clue as to why he did this. Look at verses 21 and 22. Israel moved on again. Now he's no longer called Jacob. Who is he? Israel. Israel moved on again, and he pitched his tent beyond Migdal Eder. While Israel was living in that region, Reuben went in and slept with his father's concubine, Bilhah, and Israel heard of it. Jacob had 12 sons, and he's going to list them in the next verses. But I want you to notice this. While he was there, Reuben went in and he slept with one of his concubines, Bilhah. Now, very few people, even scholars, truly understand what Reuben did, why he did it, and the implications of it. You see, Reuben didn't sleep with Bilhah because of lust. No. They didn't get caught up in the passion of the moment, and before they knew it, they had sex. This was a lurid affair. He was just attracted to a cougar. No. Reuben slept with Bilhah as a calculated move. This was predetermined. Lust had nothing to do with it. Let me say that again. Lust had nothing to do with it. This was a calculated move, and most people don't know that. They read this and they go, unstable as water, got caught up in the emotions, and they had this lurid affair. No. Reuben slept with Bilhah for two reasons. The first reason was to make sure that Bilhah didn't usurp his mother's position as Jacob's chief wife now that Rachel was dead. Now, if you remember, Jacob had two wives and he had two concubines. The concubines were each wife's maidservant. Remember when Laban gave them to Jacob to be his wife? As a wedding present, he gave each one of his daughters a maidservant. Now, remember what happened. When Rachel couldn't conceive, she said, well, you're going to take my maidservant and you're going to sleep with her. So she became a concubine. Well, she also got upset and wouldn't let Jacob sleep with Leah. So what did Leah do? Okay, you won't let her sleep with her. I understand that. There's a lot of jealousy. But she then took her maidservant and gave it to Jacob as a concubine. So Jacob had two legitimate wives and two concubines. Now, Rachel was his favorite wife. Hey, can't make any excuses, can't tell you any different. Just read the story. You understand it. Rachel he loved. Leah, sorry. And now that Rachel was dead, Reuben was afraid that Jacob might elevate Bilhah to the status of a legitimate wife. And she would become Jacob's favorite wife instead of Leah, who was Reuben's mother. So by sleeping with Bilhah, he had defiled her, and now Jacob could never sleep with her again. Technically, she became what was known by Jews as a living widow, just like David's concubines when his son Absalom slept with him. We'll look at that story in just a little bit. So Reuben solidified Leah's position by sleeping with Bilhah. Leah's maidservant couldn't do it. Why couldn't she become a favorite wife and be a legitimate wife? Because Leah was still alive. But now that Rachel was dead, her maidservant Bilhah could have been elevated to a legitimate wife, and then Leah would be second again. And Reuben said, you're not going to do that to my mama. So as a calculated move, he goes in and he sleeps with Bilhah, which means that she's defiled, and Jacob, according to the customs, can never sleep with her again. So she can't be elevated to a legitimate wife. But that's only the first reason that he slept with her, and really that's kind of a secondary reason. The primary reason, the second reason that he slept with Bilhah, was to solidify his position as the future leader of the family, the firstborn. You see, at that time, the eldest son, the firstborn, inherited the father's wives and the concubines along with the double portion of the estate. Remember, we talked about this when we were talking about Jacob and Esau, and I told you that the firstborn always received a double portion as long as he received the blessing. And the reason he received a double portion was because it was his responsibility to take care of his father's wives and the concubines. Now, the firstborn, any of the sons for that matter, were restricted from having sex with any of his father's legitimate wives, but not so with the concubines. In fact, the father's concubines now became the son's concubines. So if he was the firstborn, when the father passed away and he had received the blessing, the right of the firstborn, the birthright, then his responsibility was to take care of all of the women, but the concubines also became his concubines. Now, here's what people don't understand, and this is very important. Pay close attention. At that point, he was expected to have sex with his father's concubines to show that he was the legitimate heir. It validated his position as the new leader and the successor after his father's death. And if you don't know that, if you don't understand this custom, a lot of the stories in the Old Testament don't make sense. You're reading along and you're reading the story about David and Absalom, and you go, that doesn't make sense. You're reading the story of Solomon and Adonijah, and you go, that doesn't make sense. You're reading the story of Ishbosheth. Remember that story? Probably not. And Abner, and it doesn't make sense. But if you understand this custom, everything makes perfect sense. But if you don't understand this custom, that's like, do what? Now, let me show you what I'm talking about. How many of you remember the story of Absalom's rebellion? Do you remember the story? Absalom desires to be king. And he's not going to be the firstborn. He's not going to have the birthright. He's not the oldest. But he is one good-looking guy. He's very smart. The women just swoon over him. I mean, if the Bible talks about how good-looking you are, you've got to be good-looking because you had a lot of good-looking people back then. You were closer to Adam and Eve. You know, we didn't have all these mutations with the genes. He had all this hair. When he had his hair cut, the women would keep it. I mean, he was this good-looking guy, and he decided one day that he wants to be king. So he stands at the gate, and when people come that want to see the king, he goes, well, he's too busy. If I were king, I would listen to you, and he would listen to them. And he started building these alliances, and he started getting all of these leaders to come on his side. Now, eventually, as he begins to pull these leaders to his side, he starts getting all of these people on his side, and he begins to build an army. And pretty soon his army is so strong that when he finally decides to rebel against David, David has to flee from Jerusalem. Do you remember the story? And so he flees with all of his people except for 10 of his concubines. He leaves them in Jerusalem for the sole purpose of taking care of the palace. So when Absalom comes along with his army and he takes Jerusalem, he takes it without a fight. And he goes up to the palace and there's no one there but these 10 concubines. And so Ahithophel, who's his advisor, who had once been David's advisor, and he had followed Absalom, he wanted to stay with the winner. He says, you know what, if you want to solidify this in the eyes of the people, here's what you need to do. You need to sleep with your father's concubines, and you need to do it where everyone sees it so people will know you are now succeeding him as the king. This will validate your claim that you're the king. Now, let me just show you the scriptures because most of you don't understand the story because you didn't understand this custom. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 16. So the king and all his household set out at once. He left no one behind except 10 of his concubines to look after the palace. Now, jump down to verse 22, same chapter, chapter 15. So they set up a tent on the palace roof where everyone could see it. Wow. And Absalom went in and he had sex with his father's concubines. This was meant to show that David was dead to Absalom and he was the king now. David's concubines were now his concubines. You see, not only did the firstborn do this, this validated, this legitimized him as the firstborn. Not his father's wives, but his concubines. You went in and purposely slept with them. But also, when a conquering king came in, he wouldn't sleep with the king that he conquered his wives, but he would sleep with his concubines. How many of you knew that? That was to legitimize that you were the conquering king. What is his is now yours. Now, one last scripture. This is 2 Samuel chapter 20, verse 3. I want to show you where the Jews get the term living widows. This is verse 3 in chapter 20. When David came to his palace in Jerusalem, Absalom's dead now. He's been killed. He took the 10 concubines he had left to look after the palace, and he placed them in seclusion. Their needs were provided for, but he no longer slept with them. So each of them lived like a widow until she died. And this is where the term living widow comes from in the Jewish customs. But once Reuben slept with Bilhah, Jacob couldn't do it. Smart move. But that was only the first reason. The second reason he did it is because he wanted to show that I am the legitimate firstborn. My father's concubines will be my concubines. Now let me give you 2 more examples so you'll understand how ingrained this custom was in the Israel culture. When Saul died, his son Ishbosheth became king. So his father's concubines, not his wives, not legitimate wives, his concubines, his harem became his concubines. But he suspected Abner, the commander of his army, who had fought for Saul, was the commander of Saul's army, so now he was the commander of Ishbosheth's army. He accused him of sleeping with one of his father's concubines. Now, you need to understand how deadly this accusation is. Because when he accused him of this would have been seen as an attempt to succeed Saul. So when he accused Abner of sleeping with his father's concubines, he was accusing him of sedition. And I want you to notice how mad Abner becomes, because he was accusing him of trying to take the throne. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 3, verses 7 through 8. One day Ishbosheth, Saul's son, accused Abner of sleeping with one of his father's concubines, a woman named Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah. Abner was furious. Am I some Judean dog to be kicked around like this, he shouted. After all I have done for your father Saul and his family and his friends by not handing you over to David, is this my reward? That you find fault with me about this woman. In other words, he's saying, you accuse me of sedition? You're accusing me of trying to take the throne? You see, this, if he would have truly done this, was the saying that I have a claim to be the successor. I'm not recognizing him as the successor. I am the successor. So how many of you know the rest of the story? Abner goes to David and he says, he's ticked me off. He accused me of sedition. I've been so loyal to him, and he accused me of sleeping with one of his father's concubines. He accused me of trying to take the throne. I'm with you now. And of course, we know the story because Abner had killed Joab's brother. He goes in and he kills him, and it doesn't work out. But that's why Abner was so upset. You're reading through this. If you don't understand this custom of the concubines, it doesn't make sense. Now, let me give you one last example, because most of you do not understand what Solomon did with Adonijah. David became very, very old. When he became very old, he couldn't keep warm. And they knew he was dying, but he just complained of being cold, and they kept piling covers on him, couldn't get warm. So someone came up with this great idea. He just needs a sweet young thing. So they went out and got him a young virgin. And of course, she strips off all of her clothes and climbs in bed with him, and her job is to be one of his concubines. Well, we know the story. He's so old, they don't have sex, but she's technically one of his concubines. Well, her name is Abishag. Now, Adonijah wants to be the king. He wants to receive the birthright. So what he does when David gets so old is he goes out and he begins to get all of these leaders from David's army with him and all the commanders, and he begins to proclaim his king, and he gets all of them on his side. So he's having this big feast as his dad is dying, and he's proclaiming himself king. Well, those who are loyal to David and knew that God wanted Solomon to be king and knew that that's what David wanted also, what did they do? They went to David and they said, I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know that you wanted Adonijah, your son, to be king. I thought God wanted Solomon to be king, and that was your will. And David says, do what? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you knew. Your son Adonijah wants to be king. And so what did he do? He said, bring my royal mule, put my cloak on him, have him go. And he leads him down to, of course, the pools. And he says, and have everyone proclaim that I am officially calling Solomon or making Solomon the king. And so they do that, and all of the town begins to yell. Well, where they're having this feast, Adonijah is with all these leaders. They hear it, and someone comes in and says, David just made Solomon king. And boy, everyone who's with Adonijah, they don't want to be seen. So they start sneaking out. And finally, Adonijah realizes what's going to happen, so he runs to the temple. And he puts his hands on the horns of the altar. And he's not going to come out until Solomon promises he won't kill him. Solomon says, I'm not going to kill you. Come on out. As long as you abide in peace, you won't come out. And then this interesting thing happens that involves one of David's concubines. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 13 through 25. This is the last example I'm going to give you, and we're going to close with this. One day Adonijah, whose mother was Haggith, now this is after he tried to be king, and it failed, and Solomon's king, came to see Bathsheba, Solomon's mother. Have you come with peaceful intention? She asked him. Why? Because he tried to become king, remember? Yes, he said, I come in peace. In fact, I have a favor to ask of you. What is it? Bathsheba asked. He replied, as you know, the kingdom was rightfully mine. Rightfully mine. I should have had the birthright. All Israel wanted me to be the next king. I had the people on my side. But the tables were turned and the kingdom went to my brother instead, for that is the way the Lord wanted it. So now I have just one favor to ask of you. Please don't turn me down. What is it? She asked. He replied, speak to King Solomon on my behalf, for I know he will do anything you request. Ask him to let me marry Abishag, the girl from Shunem. Now, who is Abishag? David's concubines, the newest one. Young thing, pretty. David never slept with her, but she was technically one of his concubines. So, whose concubines did she become when David died? Solomon's. And he was expected to sleep with the concubines to validate his claim as the birthright. Not with the wives. He was to take care of them and the concubines, but this validated that he was the firstborn. The birthright was his. The blessing came to him. All right, Bathsheba replied, I will speak to the king for you. So Bathsheba went to King Solomon to speak on Adonijah's behalf. The king rose from his throne to meet her, and he bowed down before her. When he sat down on his throne again, the king ordered that a throne be brought for his mother. What great respect he has for her, and Adonijah knew that. And she sat at his right hand. I have one small request to make of you, Bathsheba said. I hope you won't turn me down. What is it, my mother asked? You know I won't refuse you. Then let your brother Adonijah marry Abishag, the girl from Shunem, she replied. All of a sudden, Solomon goes berserk. How can you possibly ask me to give Abishag to Adonijah, King Solomon demanded. You might as well ask me to give him the kingdom. You know that he's my older brother and that he has Abiathar, the priest, and Joab, son of Zeruiah, on his side. Then King Solomon made a vow before the Lord. May God strike me and even kill me if Adonijah has not sealed his fate with this request. Now, why is he so upset? Why is he saying, you know that he's the older brother? You know that he has these two people on his side. Why is he saying that? Because he's saying, if I was to allow that, that would legitimize his claim. That would validate his claim. And he would be able to tell the people, see, even Solomon recognizes that I have a right to it. So notice what he does. He has established my dynasty as he promised. So as surely as the Lord lives, Adonijah will die this very day. So King Solomon ordered Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, to execute him, and Adonijah was put to death. Now, if you don't know this custom, you're like, what was the big deal? It's because Solomon said, you still want the king, you sneaky dude, and you were trying to sleep with one of my father's concubines to validate, legitimize your claim, and you would have turned it against me. You're dead. And you don't know this if you don't know the custom. So back to the story, and we end with this. By sleeping with Bilhah, Reuben was trying to lay claim to his inheritance as the firstborn, but he was doing it prematurely. And because he tried to claim it prematurely, Jacob wasn't dead. He actually lost his birthright for doing that. Look at Genesis 49, verses 3 through 4. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my strength, the child of my vigorous youth. You are first in rank and first in power. It should have been yours. But you are as unruly as a flood, and you will be first no longer. For you went to bed with my concubine, you defiled my marriage couch. How dare you prematurely do this and usurp my authority? It would have been yours, but what you've shown me is you have no claim to it. And now it's going to be passed on to the next in line. Oh, wait a minute, Simeon and Levi can't do it. So who's he going to give it to? Joseph. But actually, because it's a double portion, he gives it to his two sons. Ephraim becomes the one that's big, and that's why Ephraim is always the tribe that's predominant in Israel.